Welcome to National Campus Safety Awareness Month 2017 for all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are really excited to be bringing you the first in our series of webinars for this year called First Step, Building Clery and Title IX Reporting Structures, as Megan has already mentioned to you. My name is Laura Egan. I'm the Senior Director of Training and Technical Assistance at Clery Center, and today I am joined by my colleague Abby, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Abigail Boyer. I'm the Associate Executive Director of Programs here at the Clery Center. During this webinar, I'm going to be online helping to assist with any questions that you have and being able to support the work of Laura, my other colleagues on the line. So I'm excited to be with you all here today.
Great, thanks so much, Abby. And today we're also joined by our friends and colleagues at the Network for Victim Recovery of DC. We are really excited to be bringing this topic to you today, but we would be remiss if we did not note that we recognize that there is also a major announcement coming through during our webinar from the Department of Education through the Secretary of Education. And so what is going to be happening today during this webinar, as the topic is focused similarly in the area of Title IX, is Abby will be monitoring that release of information, as well as Bridget from the Network for Victim Recovery, and we will be informing you all as we can what that information is and how, if at all, it impacts the content of our webinar today. We really do not anticipate that it will impact our content. This content certainly is still relevant for everybody today, as it really is just focused on the reporting of incidents, whether you are a campus security authority or a responsible employee under Title IX. We'll certainly go into all of that content in more detail as we move throughout the webinar today. But we just wanted to acknowledge that we are aware that that announcement is taking place. It is very, opportunely timed in with our webinar today, so we appreciate all of you making the time to still attend this webinar, and want you all to recognize that we are getting that information in real time, just like all of you. So we will really try to make it a point to touch on that information as we feel it is relevant and helpful, but we don't want to focus so much on that we detract from the meaning of our webinar today, and we will certainly be able to try to answer as many questions as we can throughout the webinar today, but we might have to postpone some of those answers if we truly just don't know the right answer based on the information coming through. I would like to take a moment to let Bridget and Maggie introduce themselves as well before we continue with our content for today. So please take it away, Bridget and Maggie.
Hi everyone, this is Bridget Stumpf, and I'm the Co-Executive Director here at Network for Victim Recovery of DC, and I'm joined by Maggie.
And my name is Maggie Schmidt, and I'm one of the staff attorneys who works at the Network for Victim Recovery, serving victims of crime in the DC area.
Great, thank you both so much. So before we start today, we always like to make sure that we are focusing our education or our training on why we are here today. And the Clery Center is founded by the parents of Jean Clery. Jean was a student at Lehigh University when, in the spring of her first year, she was unfortunately raped and murdered and in her dorm room on campus. Her parents, Connie and Howard, were devastated by their loss and vowed to make sure that they could do everything in their power to ensure that this wouldn't happen to another family again. And in that work, they began a lot of legislative work at the ground level in their home state of Pennsylvania, and that work translated into what we now know as the Clery Act today. And similarly, they founded a nonprofit organization that was originally called Security on Campus, but is known today as Clery Center. And we say all that to say, and we hold this image of Jean very dear to our hearts, both in the work that we do and in even our physical location of our office, to refocus and recenter and reframe that we are here because of the loss of a person, and all of us choose to do this work every day because we care about making our communities better, and our communities are made up of people. And so while this work may sometimes feel like it is focusing on doing things as opposed to working towards a goal or maybe being a little bit more holistic, we are here to remind you that that work is all the same thing. It is all really focused on ensuring that we are bettering the lives of each other and of our communities. And it all began because of one life in particular in this circumstance when we're talking about the Clery Act in particular. And so thank you all again just for choosing to make this a part of your day and for choosing to support the efforts around National Campus Safety Awareness Month. When we talk about the Clery Center and the work that Clery Center works towards, we really want to emphasize as well that we have come a long way from our original work, and while we recognize that that work was really important and necessary at that time, we are very focused and forward-thinking today on how we are partnering with colleges and universities to make sure that the messages that we want to get through to them are approached in a partnership fashion. We know that institutions never function well in fear, and we want to make sure that we are a resource to campuses today to understand not just the bare bones aspects of how they have to implement the Clery Act, but also the spirit of that Clery Act and what that means. So we just want to make sure that we share that with you today as well. In talking through some of our programs and initiatives that we are really proud of at Clery Centers, to give you a small idea of some of the things that we're responsible for, this is already one of them. This is one of our flagship programs, National Campus Safety Awareness Month, and we're very proud of the work that we accomplished through it. We also have been very successful in our training programs, the Jean Clery Act training seminars that are the result of a grant given to us by the Department of Education in 2005. We hold about 8 to 10 of those trainings throughout the year, and they are focused on thinking about the big picture groundings of the Clery Act, as well as implementing the Clery Act in very specific ways as well. If you are interested in gaining information about those trainings, all that information can be found on our website. We also really like to highlight our Clery Center membership program. Our membership program is an opportunity for institutions to join as a team the Clery Center. And when you join Clery Center as a member, you gain access to a ton of free resources, access to a network of peers in the field, as well as discounts on trainings, and the opportunity to have your annual security report reviewed each year. Our Clery Center membership program truly models the message that we hope to impart to all of the institutions that we interact with through our education and training, which is that you cannot do this work alone. The Clery Act itself has evolved over time to become a law that is really based on emphasizing the importance of institutionalization of compliance with the law, as well as the institutionalization of campus safety in general. And what we teach through the membership program itself is that you can't just join the membership program as one person. Your institution truly needs to join, which means a team of individuals that all are responsible for intersecting with Clery compliance must join as well. And so we really value how that membership program models the work that we try to impart and teach throughout all of our trainings and resources. And we encourage you to look into it if you're interested in joining as a member, to ask myself or Abby if you have any questions. I believe Abby just put through a link through the chat box. If there is any information that you would like to know further about membership, please do not hesitate to reach out. And NVRDC, I just would like to give you all an opportunity to talk through your mission and values and work as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Laura and Abby and the Clery Center for making sure to include us in today's presentation. This is Bridget, and Maggie and I are thrilled to be joining such a star-studded team to discuss these issues during Campus Security Awareness Month. NVRDC is a holistic victim services organization serving the nation's capital, and we aim to empower crime victims of all types to achieve survivor-defined justice by providing acute crisis advocacy, ongoing case management, and free civil and crime victims' rights legal services. And we're actually intentionally created as an organization with a model that brings together both case management and legal services with the intent that we're creating a more supportive environment for someone to process their experience and learn about their options on how they want to move forward following victimization. With all of that being said, as a direct service organization, one of the areas of legal services that we offer to victims of gender-based violence is Title IX representation during the campus administrative processes at all of the 8 colleges and universities here in the district. So we're hoping to bring some of our expertise through that specific lens to the webinar today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bridget. So many of you might be asking, Laura, you keep saying National Campus Safety Awareness Month, and I've really never heard of that before. What is this? What do you do with it? How can this benefit me? And so we do want to take a quick moment to just talk about what we call NACSAM is. What National Campus Safety Awareness Month aims to be is a month dedicated to talking through the community aspect of taking care of one's campus and creating an environment that is ensuring safety and campus safety awareness overall. This has been a month that's existed since 2008 due to an act through Congress. And each year we try to focus on providing an abundance of free professional development resources for campus safety professionals and just professionals in higher education in general. And this year's theme is Take the First Step. And that theme came through because this has definitely been a year where many of the projects and work that we do on campuses can feel overwhelming, particularly if you might be one person on your campus who has the role of Clery compliance as an add-on responsibility to many other things that you do. Or even if you are a full-time Clery compliance individual or campus safety individual, it still is an enormous task because the Clery Act, as we've said, has evolved over time to include many more things beyond just the classification of geography or crime. There are many aspects of prevention and response and student conduct and employee conduct proceedings that are now a part of the Clery Act. And so when you take all of those things into consideration, in addition to other aspects of campus safety like fire safety or emergency notifications or threat assessment, it really can become an overwhelming or comprehensive program. When we are talking about breaking this down into manageable steps, we want to make sure that we are providing all of you with actionable items and tools that you can leave each of our interactions with to take back to your campuses to begin doing the work that might feel really overwhelming. So through the course of this month, you'll see information about webinars that we are offering in addition to some actual tools and resources as well, which we will be highlighting through each of our webinars. You'll also be able to network with peers in the field through the webinars themselves. And you'll be gaining information into all of the other things that Clery Center can offer to you and your campus community. So if you would like some more information about NACSAM, please feel free to visit our website, which is linked in this slide here. When you access that website, you'll have access to all of our resources from last year and this year as well. So there are some archived tools and webinars in that website that you might find helpful also. So we are really excited that you, again, took the time to join us today. Our next webinar will be next Tuesday, and that is providing an overview of the basics of Clery and answering some frequently asked questions as well. But to get more into our content for today, what I wanted to do quickly is just provide a brief Clery Act refresher to account for the fact that there might be a variety of levels of experience with the individuals joining us today on today's webinar. So in summation, the Clery Act is a federal consumer protection law that is designed to promote transparency between campus constituents and campus administration, specifically in regards to crime on campus. When we are talking about the who of the Clery Act, we're really talking about a group of reporting authorities known as campus security authorities. And we will get into a little bit more in today's webinar about who constitutes a CSA and what their role is on a campus. We also are talking about local law enforcement because local law enforcement may also provide information in the form of statistics that would be included within your campus's total of Clery Act statistics, depending on whether or not your campus has non-campus property or whether or not you are soliciting from your local law enforcement, as you should, if they have any crime statistics that relate to your campus. So the who that you need to be concerned about really are campus security authorities and local law enforcement, as they are typically the sources of your Clery Act statistics information. When we're talking about the where, one thing that is unique to the Clery Act is the concept of Clery Act geography. So one aspect of Clery Act compliance is maintaining your Clery Act crime statistics. And your statistics are a reflection of the reports of Clery-specific crimes, which we will touch on, that have been reported by a CSA that occur within Clery Act geography, which are specifically defined aspects of your institution's property or building. Your Clery Act geography contains your on-campus property, which is fairly direct. It's your core campus. Your non-campus property, which might be buildings or property that your institution owns or controls that is not reasonably contiguous to your core campus. And then public property, which is public property immediately within and adjacent to your core campus. When we're talking about the what and the how of the Clery Act, we separate that into two categories. So the Clery Act calls for both annual and ongoing requirements. Annually, institutions must report Clery statistics and provide information on certain aspects of campus safety policies and procedures through a document called the Annual Security Report, which must be published by October 1st of each year. Additionally, they need to provide their Clery Act statistics to the Department of Education each year. We should also say, too, that the Clery Act applies to any institution of higher education in the United States that receives federal funding. In an ongoing capacity, the Clery Act calls for institutions to make timely warnings to their campus community when a Clery Act crime that occurs within Clery geography poses a serious or ongoing threat to the campus community. Clery Act also asks for institutions to present emergency notifications to their campus should a non-Clery Act crime, perhaps, be occurring on campus that is an emergency that needs to be addressed immediately. Examples of a type of incident that would cause an emergency notification might be an active shooter situation. It could be a chemical spill. It could be a bomb going off. It could be a significant weather situation. Additionally, the Clery Act calls for institutions to maintain a log of all crimes reported to the campus security or police department that occur within the institution's patrol jurisdictions. And then lastly, it calls for the rights and options of survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking to be employed for both students and employees on a campus. That last piece is the most recent addition to the Clery Act through the VAWA amendments to Clery, which passed in 2013. And lastly, the Clery Act is enforced by the Department of Education's Clery Compliance Team, which is housed within the Office of Financial Aid within the Department of Education. With all of that said, I would like to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. So this is Maggie, and so I'm going to run through a quick refresher of Title IX. And under Title IX, the important individuals we look at are responsible employees. Those are the individuals who have the reporting requirements. And unlike Clery, Title IX is not location dependent, so you can't just draw a map around where the reporting will occur. So reporting under Title IX is dependent on what role the individual is playing when they receive information about sex-based discrimination. So this means it's not where an individual is, but what role they're playing at that time they hear the information. Also for Title IX purposes, the incident of sex-based violence, whether it's harassment or assault, has to involve at least one student at the institution. However, institutions should also see if there are additional reporting laws required by their state law, either through statute or case law. So for Title IX specifically, the what and the how, Title IX prohibits sex-based discrimination in federally funded education programs, so similar to Clery. This includes allegations of sexual harassment and sexual assault. Sexual assault was specifically named in the April 2011 Dear Colleague letter from the Office for Civil Rights. And Title IX regulations, the sub-regulatory guidance has noted that one instance of sexual violence is sex-based discrimination and can create a hostile environment. And Title IX, how is it enforced? There are actually two ways in which Title IX violations can be enforced. One is by filing a Office for Civil Rights complaint with the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. And also survivors can file a civil lawsuit against their college or university. So they can actually go into a courthouse and file a civil lawsuit as well as going to the federal government.
Great. Thank you so much, Maggie. So before we move forward with today's content, we did want to note some resources that all of you might find helpful as we go through the rest of our information for you all today. In reference to the Clery Act, it's most helpful to be thinking through the statute and the regulations themselves. So when you have the opportunity to view those online, we would recommend that you do so. The Clery Act statute can also be found in its entirety at the end of the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting, which we have included as a web link below in the web links pod. The handbook is a document that is published by the Department of Education that provides information on implementation of the Clery Act. It is technically considered sub-regulatory guidance in that it is not the regulations or the law itself. However, the Department of Education's Clery compliance team has been very clear in stating that this is the document that it will use when it conducts a program review of an institution's overall Clery compliance. So these are the standards by which they will measure whether or not an institution is adhering to the Clery Act compliance and law. Lastly, under Clery, or one more thing under Clery, I should say, there is an organization called WESTAT. WESTAT is a private federal contractor that, a private organization that contracts with the federal government to provide technical assistance on the Clery Act on behalf of the Department of Education. They run an organization or an offer a service that is sometimes casually called the help desk. WESTAT is a really helpful resource because they are in the best position to give the most formal answer to a specific question around how to classify an incident or a piece of Clery geography, or whether or not to consider an individual a CSA, or any other specific aspect of Clery guidance. So you might hear us say today, if we get a question that comes through that is very institution specific or is looking for a, quote, what is the right answer, you might hear us reference WESTAT and say that's a great question for WESTAT. And that's why, because they are really working on behalf of the enforcement authority, so they are in the best position to provide that more specific answer or resource. And their contact information is provided there for anybody that would need it. Additionally, the Department of Education does conduct what we call and what they call program reviews for institutions to determine whether or not they are fully in compliance with all aspects of the Clery Act. These program reviews can occur randomly. They can occur as a result of a media inquiry into a major, I'm sorry, not a media inquiry. An incident might cause a lot of attention via the media, and so the department might decide that they would like to conduct a review because an incident is getting so much attention. Or they can occur because of a complaint filed against an institution claiming that the institution is out of compliance with Clery. The Department of Education publishes the results of these program reviews for the public to view, and we find them to be very helpful as they note trends in campuses' gaps in complying with the Clery Act. And so we often use the language and information from these program reviews to inform our own education and training materials. So we highlight that here as a resource because, like we said, they're publicly accessible. So if you were ever looking for more information through them, they are easily found on the Office of Financial Aid's Clery compliance website. Additionally, the dear colleague, I'm sorry, Maggie, actually, why don't you talk a little bit about the resources that we have down here for Title IX. And additionally, it's not on this slide, but we did also reference the 2001 guidance too. So if you wanted to talk about that, that would be great.
All right, no problem. So the three documents that will be really helpful when looking at these issues is the Dear Colleague letter from April 2011. That's the first one I mentioned that explicitly named that sexual assault was sex-based discrimination that colleges and universities needed to respond to. And additionally, in light of that and a lot of questions that college and universities had, there's also the question and answers on Title IX and sexual violence, which runs through a number of things such as what should your policy include? Who's a responsible employee? How should your disciplinary procedure go? So that's a very helpful document. And additionally, we've also included the 2001 guidance, which is actually guidance that was done way before that actually looked at a number of these issues and was open for public comment. And so for looking at your Title IX side, we really suggest those three, which are provided in the files in this webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, Maggie. It's very helpful. So today what we hope to do is talk through what are the most helpful pieces to consider when designing a very streamlined and or complementary reporting system for both your Clery Act reporting and your Title IX reporting. We want to also provide the forum to have you all share some challenges or questions that you have related to reporting responsibilities, so that we can offer some possible solutions or new ways to think about achieving those goals. And in the course of our content today, we'll actually be reviewing two flowcharts that Clery Center has designed to hopefully address these areas in some way. They are the Who Are You flowchart and the Information Received flowchart. And we'll talk through the content of those throughout, but that has also been linked in the files pod and was sent to you as an attachment in the email you received this morning with the login information for today's webinar. And like we said earlier too, as in addition to going through these flowcharts, you'll have the opportunity to participate through today's webinar through a couple of different interactive options that we encourage you to take to make use of. We'll have some chat box questions for you, which will be opportunities for you to share answers through that chat pod that you have on your screen. We'll also be asking some questions through polls, and so the polls will be launched through our platform, and you'll be able to answer them that way. And then just in general, we'll be taking your questions throughout. Abby's already doing a great job of addressing some of those, but please feel free to ask them. If for some reason we do not get to every question during today's webinar, as there are quite a few attendees on, we'll be sure to review the questions at the end of the webinar and get in touch with anybody that we think would benefit from hearing an answer from us. Great. So to get things started, we would love to have a better idea of who is joining us today in terms of what your role is on campus. So we're going to launch this poll for you to just have the opportunity to answer what your role is. So we are asking if you are Title IX, if you're part of General Counsel, Campus Police or Security, if you are part of Residence Life, Greek Life, Athletics, or Human Resources, Student Conduct, or even Other. And if you're Other, we're definitely going to ask some examples of what that is. So please don't hold back. But we'll give you a couple of moments to answer that poll now. You are able to answer the poll directly through that pod that should come up for you all, so you don't have to put the answer through the chat box. You can just click on the actual option within the poll screen itself, just so you all know that. Okay, but our responses are coming in, which is really great and really helpful. It looks like the majority of folks at this point are either coming from Campus Police or Security or Others. So I'd love to know who we did not capture in our categories here for you all. So if some of you are Other, just please let us know where you're coming from. I do see faculty, I see emergency management, I see student services, a Title IV compliance officer, great. I see many folks are also from Title IX, which makes a lot of sense, which is awesome. Okay, great. Thank you so much for conducting that poll. Megan, for us? And as soon as that poll is over, we'll just click on to the next slide. So thank you for your patience. Great to see so many folks from so many different areas joining us today. I continue to see the responses coming through, such as OVW Campus Grant Program Coordinators, which is wonderful, risk management and compliance, some general counsel folks, which is great. So another poll we want to launch quickly is, in the roles that you are in, if this does not apply to you, do not feel the need to answer, but you can obviously answer no. Do you currently receive reports from either campus security authorities, CSAs, or responsible employees? So just take a couple of seconds to answer that poll. And remember, too, that you can just answer the poll by choosing yes or no in the poll screen itself. You do not have to submit an answer through the chat pod. And if for some reason you're not seeing that poll screen, please feel free to let us know in that support or private Q&A pod. Okay, but as the answers are coming through, I definitely see that the majority of folks responding do receive reports from either CSAs or responsible employees, which is really helpful and awesome, and makes sense that you'd be joining us today. So please keep that in mind as we go through the rest of the content and ask questions that you think would be beneficial to your role, particularly as somebody that's receiving a report from a CSA or a responsible employee. Okay. Thank you so much again for launching this poll for us, Megan. So before we can talk about the best way to manage reporting systems, we want to make sure we're all on the same page about what the different types of reporting authorities are under Clery and Title IX and what information should be shared by each set of individuals. So I'll first talk about campus security authorities, and then I will let Maggie talk through responsible employees a little bit. So campus security authorities are a specific named set of individuals on a college campus. They would be individuals that either work in a campus security office or a campus police department, individuals to whom other individuals on campus have been told to report crimes. So sometimes on a smaller campus that might go beyond a security office, or it might be a human resources office, an equity office, a compliance office. In addition to those two sets of individuals, it would be anybody on campus that is responsible for ensuring access to spaces or performing other security services but might not be a part of a campus security office or a police department. And then the fourth category of CSAs are officials with significant responsibility for student and campus activities, which is an intentionally broad-based category designed to capture many different roles on campus to whom or with whom students or employees might have developed some sort of a rapport. Because we know that oftentimes individuals are more likely to share sensitive information with those that they trust. And sometimes individuals might not always have a very tight relationship or close relationship with individuals in positions of security or police, or to whom they would report a crime, or they might not even know where those individuals are located or how to access them. So that fourth category of CSAs is intentional to try to capture the most amount of reports possible. Clery, campus security authorities are responsible for sharing information about any crimes that are reported to them. Their real goal is to turn reports of crimes over to the campus crime collection body. So in many campuses that would be your campus security office or your police department, but it could be anybody on campus that has been designated as the receptacle of those crime reports. So that might be a Clery compliance office or a Clery compliance officer or an EEO office, an equity and compliance office. It could be any of those things, truly. But the main thing to remember is that it is not a CSA's role to investigate a report of a crime. It's not even really a CSA's role to determine whether or not what was shared with them actually is a Clery crime occurring within Clery geography. What really their goal is to share that information and not hold on to information of a reported crime, but pass it along to individuals whose role it is to determine whether or not that incident is a Clery crime within Clery geography. CSAs are not required to share personally identifiable information. They are required to share information about the nature of the incident that was shared with them, when it occurred, where it occurred, and if they know the disposition of that incident at that time, if it's a current report, if it's something that occurred a long time ago, et cetera. And then again, they are really responsible for sharing information about all Clery crimes, but it's not so much that CSAs need to absolutely know the definitions of all Clery crimes, as much as it is intentional that CSAs have a broader reporting responsibility than responsible employees. And so I'll let Maggie now talk through some of the qualities of responsible employees about who they are and what they're required to share.
All right, so responsible employees a little bit different than our CSAs, and these are individuals who are identified by the institution in accordance with the guidance. And so the Q&A that I mentioned earlier, along with the 2001 OCR guidance, goes more in depth into the types of individuals that institutions should be considering in naming these responsible employees. So one of the things to consider is a responsible employee can include employees who a student could reasonably believe has the authority or duty to report this material. And one of the things to keep in mind is that because each institution designates their own responsible employees, what might be a responsibility of one institution might be different at another. So you really have to look at what your institution decides on. And when a report is made, the individual who's designated as a responsible employee has to report all relevant details about the incident they receive. And however, the sub-regulatory guidance provides that these reports should be made with the consideration of confidentiality requests of the victim. And Bridget will talk a little bit more about that in a second. And as stated before, the reporting requirement will depend on what role an individual is playing at the time the information was received. So if an individual who works at an institution has 3 roles on campus and 2 of them make that individual responsible employee and 1 does not, they'll have to look at what role they were in when they received this information. And if they were in the responsible employee role, they'll have the reporting requirement, but if not, they won't have the responsible employee reporting requirement. I'm going to kick it to Bridget as well.
Yeah, you'll see the notation about confidentiality in the slide, and what's important regarding confidentiality for responsible employees is to understand that schools are in fact required to consider a range of factors in order to determine how they may be able to honor a student's request for confidentiality while still providing a safe environment for all students. We'll get a little bit more into the details about what that really looks like in practice when we get into some of the case scenarios and walk through the flow charts here in a little bit.
Great, thank you both so much. Super helpful. So with that knowledge, we want to move into one of our first chat box questions. So Janice is a campus security authority under the Clery Act and a responsible employee under Title IX. How are reporting authorities directed? Oops, oops. Just kidding, we're doing a little magic. We're doing a little magic. The slides will come back in a moment. But from what I can share with you, the slide is asking folks to consider how are reporting authorities directed to make reports at your institution if they are both CSAs and responsible employees. So we would love for you to provide some answers through the chat box pod about what your institution says to those that are considered both CSAs and responsible employees about how they should make a report. So we will look for those responses to come through. So again, it's what does your institution say to those that are CSAs and responsible employees in regards to how they should make a report at your institution? Do they use one form? Do they make multiple reports? Does the form that they do complete or fill out ask for them to identify themselves as a CSA or a responsible employee? What are some of those tricks and tools and resources that you all use to capture reports from individuals on your campus that are both CSAs and responsible employees? Many folks are typing, I know, so that might be causing a little bit of a backup in getting answers, which is totally okay. And thank you so much for your patience with our slides. I see we are back to being perfect, so thank you so much, Megan and Amy, for your support there. So from what I'm seeing come through, it looks like reports are submitted into like a central reporting system like Maxians or something like that. And then individuals are, those reports are then routed to the right place based on classification. So it looks like administrators on the back end determine where that report then needs to go. So it looks like one reporting place. Most individuals are saying some individuals rather are saying report in an online form that goes directly to the Title IX coordinator, or that online form goes to the Title IX coordinator, a compliance director, and an operations individual. It looks like one form for an incident, no matter who you are, okay? Some people are saying that that one form goes to the Clery coordinator, and then if it makes sense to, the Clery coordinator forwards it to the Title IX coordinator. So this is really interesting. It's so interesting to see all the different thoughts that are coming through and all the different processes that are coming through, because they do all make sense, and it also highlights how campuses do have the ability to create a system that works for your campus culture, your campus environment. A really helpful thing to remember when you're thinking about Clery and Title IX in terms of reporting is that your Title IX coordinator is a campus security authority. So they really are that bridge between those two reporting systems. So I can totally understand how many of you are saying that that one report will go to your Title IX coordinator if the individual reporting is a responsible employee and they are very clear on the fact that their incident would be something that would be captured under Title IX, because then the Title IX coordinator can make decisions about where it needs to go. I see that a lot of people say that they just report on one form that goes to both places. And I think that also seems to account a lot for that double counting aspect, which we'll get into in a moment. Bridget and Maggie, do you have any thoughts about some of the systems that folks are sharing through the chat right now, or anything that you wanted to comment on?
Nothing now. We did get a question about whether or not residential advisors would be considered responsible employees, and just harking back to what Maggie had said about what the guidance requires of schools is that they're just clear in their designation of whether or not an RA is considered by their policy to be a responsible employee. One of the things we would throw out as a caution, if you do have a clear policy that designates a residential advisor as a responsible employee, that they should be well educated and trained on how to communicate to a student who's going to be disclosing something that would qualify as sexual violence under Title IX, that they should be clear that they are going to have to report that information and make sure that the student is put on notice that there are confidential resources to seek if, in fact, that RA is not one of those confidential resources.
Sure, absolutely. Great. So before we get into our flowcharts that we've designed, we wanted to kind of go through a couple of points about why we think a flowchart is helpful. I will also put a disclaimer in here that I recognize that this image is a line graph and not a flowchart. However, you would be surprised how difficult it is to find a cute and cartoony flowchart image that is easy for anybody to duplicate in a private slideshow. So my apologies. We do know this is not a flowchart per se, but a line graph. But I hope you can appreciate that it still is trying to demonstrate the image of a flowchart, a generic flowchart for you. But the reason we find a flowchart helpful is because, as I'm sure you've even seen with just this webinar today, there is so much information that goes into figuring out who the reporting authorities are, what their role is, what information they should be sharing. So in any type of a visual image to break down some of that information can make it a lot more easy for folks to digest. So when we are encouraging folks to create a flowchart, what we would like you to start with, if that's something that you're interested in doing on your campus or using on your campus, is to be really clear on the purpose and the intention of that flowchart and make it as targeted as possible. Sometimes flowcharts can feel overwhelming if they are trying to capture too broad a purpose. I know there's that very famous flowchart that I think might be from the Department of Defense or something that describes a couple of different military options, but that is just so difficult to understand because it's accounting for every single option. So while that intention might be to be as transparent as possible and comprehensive as possible, that meaning might get lost if it's too hard for the average reader to actually digest and consume. Additionally, the way that this can be a helpful tool is that you can use a flowchart to describe something that might be a little bit more complex or heady to folks that do not intersect with this work all the time. I know much of the talk that people have around training CSAs and responsible employees is that you put all of this effort into training individuals for something that they might have to do once or twice a year, depending on their role on campus. So creating a document like a flowchart is a really helpful takeaway for those individuals that might not intersect with this type of work all the time to keep near them so that they can reference the information you're sharing, again, in a way that resonates for them. And just make sure, too, that when you're taking into consideration flowcharts, that the style you use and the structure of that flowchart can vary. It can definitely be something that is a little bit bigger. It can be very minute and small. It can also be something that uses more images rather than words, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. And so we're going to, offer some examples to you of what we have created at Clery Center. And we are not definitely saying that these are the be-all, end-all flowcharts. We are not saying that these are the only flowcharts you should use. But we do think they offer a helpful starting point, particularly if this is something you'd like to tackle on your own campus. And we hope it inspires you to either use them or, again, start that journey for your own campus to maybe create flowcharts for yourself. So the big reveal, even though you all have seen it already, is this Who Are You reporting flowchart. So this is that first flowchart that you should have received in the attachment that you got to your email that gave you information to log into today's webinar. Basically, this walks through if you are who you could be on a college campus and whether or not that means you are a CSA or a responsible employee. So if you want to reference that flowchart briefly, we're just going to walk through following that flowchart. And Bridget and Maggie, I invite you to comment or share anything. Abby as well, if there's anything you want to share. So the first box just really starts with, okay, you should be reading this if you are either an employee, a third-party contractor, or volunteer at an institution of higher education that receives federal financial assistance. And I would assume that would be most people that are on this call today, probably except for Bridget and Maggie, as you all are employed at a nonprofit that is not a higher education institution. So you guys would not fall into this flowchart right now. The next line down is, have you received direct information from a victim, witness, or third party about a crime that has taken place? The information in italics here is taken directly from the handbook to remind folks, at least for CSAs specifically, that this does not include information that you hear indirectly or that you overhear, or information in terms of responsible employee a lens that you hear at a public event like a Take Back the Night event or a talk. So this is really talking about someone has shared information directly with you. Whether or not they know your role is not what we're talking about, but somebody directly came to you and shared information about a crime with you. So are you a CSA? So you might not know this yet, but we're going to walk through. If you are a CSA, then you would report that information to campus crime collection body, whoever that might be. And if you are not a CSA, you would ask yourself if you are a responsible employee. If you are a CSA and you make that report, you would also then still ask yourself if you are a responsible employee. So either way, you're going to get to, are you a CSA and are you a responsible employee? If the answer is yes to both, then you would have already reported that information to your campus crime collection body. And if the information contains language that is specific to a Title IX violation, you might also share that information with your Title IX coordinator. You might be doing that all in one fell swoop. So if you're making this flow chart for your campus specifically, you might not want to provide an action item until the person following the flow chart has answered whether or not they are a CSA and a responsible employee. That is totally fine. This can be your flow chart, remember. If you are not a CSA and you are not a responsible employee, you do not have to report the information, but you could report it to campus safety or police or anyone else to whom your institution directs campus crime reports go. And we say that to just be explicit that while you might not be defined in either of these roles, there is nothing in the Clery Act or Title IX that prevents you from reporting unless you truly are a pastoral or professional counselor acting in that capacity when you receive this information. Because under the Clery Act, that would exempt you from being a CSA, and you would be actually prevented from disclosing that information unless you had the consent of the reporting party or victim. So just following the line a little bit more, so if you said yes to CSA, you said yes to responsible employee, the information you were told does concern sex or gender-based discrimination, then you would go all the way down to making that report to your institution's Title IX coordinator. If that information was not concerning sex-based discrimination or violence, then you would not have to report that information under Title IX, but you would still have reported it under Clery if you are also a CSA. The last two pieces here I'm actually going to let Bridget or Maggie speak a little bit more to, where it says, note that if you're covered by a state or local privilege law, any reports should be made in compliance with that law, and additionally, if a student requests confidentiality, that should be taken into consideration. So Bridget and Maggie, would you like to speak more to that in this moment now?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important to keep in mind that OCR does not require professional counselors and pastoral counselors to report any information regarding an incident of alleged sexual violence. And schools are also not compelled to make employees who have a professional license requiring confidentiality report incidents of sexual violence in a way that identifies the student without that student's specific consent. In fact, the Q&A guidance that's been referenced today even encourages institutions to designate these non-professional counselors or advocates as confidential sources so as to create a help-seeking environment within the campus. As it relates to the intersection with local laws that may have also created a legal privilege to that confidential relationship, just thinking about it in terms of a victim advocate, if in fact someone is one of these non-professional counselors or advocates and there is an existing local privilege law that requires them to not redisclose the information without the student's consent or without a court order, even if they have consent, there needs to be a consideration about what the local law requires. For example, some specific sexual assault crisis counselor privileges in local jurisdictions require that any consent to redistribute the information that is confidential is obtained in writing. And so you just need to make sure when you're looking at that intersection of local law and confidentiality within your school's policies that if there is a higher floor of what is required in the local law, that you're making sure you're training responsible employees about what is required.
Great, thank you so much, Bridget. That was really helpful. Another point that is really helpful to bring up too in regards to the function of these flowcharts is that the action of creating them helps the institution gain clarity on what roads people should take and who reports where depending on your role. So the flowchart is not only helpful for those receiving the flowchart, but it's helpful for those creating the flowchart because it provides an avenue for the institution to gain clarity on who reports to who and when, and what happens when you do have individuals that have multiple layers of those roles. Talking through this Who Are You flowchart, we found like it would be helpful probably to use some case studies to have you all as attendees of the webinar use the flowchart to answer the questions to see if they help in doing that, and therefore if they are functional for you as a flowchart, and if they might even be something that you would like to pursue on your own campus or if you find them helpful. So this case study states, a recently hired adjunct professor calls you to report that a student disclosed after class that they were the victim of robbery on campus the previous night. The professor has not yet been through Clery or CSA training, but assumes he has to share this information with you, the Clery coordinator, as this was his role at his previous institution. So in the chat box, if you could share some of your responses while using the Who Are You flowchart to talk about this adjunct professor's reporting responsibilities. If you could share your thoughts about what this professor's reporting responsibilities are in the chat box, that would be great. So again, to take some time to use the Who Are You flowchart to answer what this adjunct professor's reporting responsibilities might be. I am actually noticing too that I think I might have been referencing, I might have jumped ahead to the information received flowchart and gone through that as opposed to the Who Are You flowchart. So I apologize if that was confusing for attendees. The flowchart you should be using to answer this case study would be the one that starts with if you are an employee, third-party contractor, or volunteer at an institution of higher education, do you fall into one or more of these categories? And this further parses out how to determine if you are a CSA or a responsible employee. So my apologies for going through the information received flowchart and not the Who Are You flowchart first. If you are looking at the PDF of the flowcharts that was sent to you or the one that is linked in the files pod, it's actually the second flowchart that is there. That is the Who Are You flowchart. So I see that some of the responses coming through are really helpful. They are noting that he is not a CSA, and there are some different ways to approach this. So that is correct. Professors, technically, faculty are named within the Clery Act as not being CSAs. Institutions, however, may still choose to name those individuals as CSAs if they feel like it fits their campus culture. So this individual, this particular professor, is specifically stating that at his previous institution, this was his role. So he assumes that he needs to report this information. So some of the ways that people could respond to that situation are, thanks so much for sharing this information. Know that perhaps at this institution, if that is the case, faculty are not considered CSAs, so you are not obligated to share this information with me. However, you can, should you choose to. But exactly, so many folks are saying now that they are reporting the information, this is what happens next. So then that information should be forwarded to the campus safety or security or police department. So again, I apologize for referencing the incorrect flowchart here, but if we wanted to take a moment to look at the Who Are You flowchart, that is the one that begins with if you are an employee, and then there are about 4 drop downs after that. So what you would first start to do are, these are each of the 4 categories of CSAs, are starting, if you're reading from left to right. We have the are you an official category. We have are you a member of the campus police or security department. Are you an individual who has such responsibilities but isn't a member of the campus police or security department. And then are you an individual or organization to whom students or employees are directed to report criminal offenses? If you are any of those 4 categories, you are considered a CSA. If you are not any of those 4 categories, you are not considered a CSA. If you follow the flow chart further down under the are you an official box, you will see that the answer is yes. And if the answer is yes, it then asks if you function as a pastoral or professional counselor on campus. So if the answer to that is yes, then you are exempt from being a CSA when functioning as a pastoral or professional counselor. And if the answer is no to that, the question further asks, are you a victim's advocate? Because as recent as the 2016 handbook, victims advocates were named as an example of a campus security authority. So what matters there, though, is if you do or do not have state or local privilege. And you'll see we've accounted for that in this flow chart by stating that if you do have state or local privilege, you are a CSA, but still must follow your state or local privilege guidelines when sharing anything more than the non-identifiable information, which is what is required to be shared under Clery. If you do not have state or local privilege, then you are a CSA and should follow institutional procedures for reporting. If you're not a victim's advocate, you still most likely are a CSA if you're that official with significant responsibilities for student and campus activities. Looking at that who are you flow chart, taking it all along the right-hand side when it's talking through whether or not an individual is a responsible employee, it's pretty straightforward here in that that definition in that first box is really taken from the regulations of Title IX as to what is defined, not regulations, I apologize, the sub-regulatory guidance of how a responsible employee is defined. So it states here, are you someone who has the authority to take action to redress sexual violence, who has been given the duty of reporting incidents of sexual violence or any other misconduct by students to the Title IX coordinator or other appropriate designee, or to whom a student could reasonably believe has this authority or duty. So if you are that, if you are, has your institution identified you or your position as a responsible employee, then that would be a yes for you are a responsible employee, no you are not. And then if you are not anybody that fits into those categories, then you are not a responsible employee and you may be a confidential resource. So that distinction here is, has your institution identified you or your position as a responsible employee? That is a really helpful designation because I know that the Department of Education is very clear on the Clery Act has already identified for institutions the categories of individuals that would be considered CSAs. It is up to institutions to inform those roles of their responsibility. Responsible employees is slightly different because you might have any of these roles up top, but the institution has the ability to identify you possibly as a confidential resource. So then you would not necessarily be considered a responsible employee in that capacity. You might still be considered a CSA, though. Bridget or Maggie, did you want to speak to any of that aspect of the who are you flow chart?
Just with the confidential resources, the sub-regulatory guidance does go into specific categories of people who would be included, and there are some individuals who might be confidential resources for Title IX purposes, but they would still qualify as CSAs. So that's definitely something to look, and the Title IX Q&A does probably the best job of outlining confidential resources and responsible employees.
Totally, completely, yes. Thank you so much. So we're going to go on to the next case study here. And this is, again, going to be using that who are you flow chart, so keep that handy. This states you are the Clery coordinator at your institution. During the trainings you conduct for staff on their crime reporting responsibilities, you distribute the who are you flow chart as a resource for them to keep on hand. It is now October, and a sociology professor approaches you sharing how helpful they felt today when they directed a student towards the campus victims advocate as a confidential resource to discuss a recent instance of possible dating violence. So in this instance, use the who are you flow chart as a guide to help this professor understand their role as well as the role of the campus victims advocate. So we wanted you to share your approach in the chat box with us. So again, keeping in mind, you as the Clery coordinator were approached by a professor who tells you that they felt really helpful by directing a student towards the campus victims advocate as a confidential resource to discuss a recent incidence of possible dating violence. So how would you approach or correct or address this professor in how they handled the situation and in how they couched or framed the referral to the advocate for that student? We will give you all folks a couple of minutes to respond. Just giving folks some time to submit their answers. Thanks so much for doing that. I know when many people write answers, it might take a little while for the answers to get loaded. So trying to be conscientious of that. So again, just using that who are you flowchart as a guide to help the professor understand their role. So what would your approach be if this professor told you that they directed a student towards the campus victims advocate and told them that the victims advocate was a confidential resource? So some of the thoughts are coming through, which is really helpful. Some people are saying that this individual, you would thank this professor and direct him to the Title IX coordinator. He should have directed the student to the Title IX coordinator. Okay, yep. So when you say thank them and direct them to the Title IX coordinator, do you mean the professor or do you mean the student? Direct the student to the Title IX coordinator. Because here are some pieces here. So truly, a campus victims advocate might no longer be considered confidential in the same way we think of a professional counselor, in that they are considered CSAs. Therefore, they are required to share non-personally identifiable information with that campus safety or security office or whatever that crime collection body is on their campus. It might be the Clery coordinator. So the point that we're trying to address here is that while the professor might have felt helpful, they possibly could have confused or misled that student by sending them in a direction that's not confidential in the same way that that student might think it's confidential. You are accurate in noting that the professor is a responsible employee himself, and so it's actually interesting that you're all saying that they should have directed the student to the Title IX coordinator. He definitely could have. He also could be going to the Title IX coordinator himself or themselves. That would have been an appropriate response as well, to know about what other actions he should be taking. You know, where a lot of people are commenting now too that responsible employees are trained at your institutions to never say that they will keep anything confidential, which is accurate, as a responsible employee is not, you know, that is not their role. Their role is to share all information that they are told with the Title IX coordinator. So, and then a lot of comments are coming through too about asking whether or not the advocate is considered confidential in this case study in particular or in general. So again, just to reiterate, victims advocates are considered a campus security authority by the Department of Education. And so that means that they are considered to function in that capacity. In previous years, they might have been considered to be more of a confidential resource along the lines of being a professional counselor. And so in that way, that they are no longer considered exempt. They never technically were considered exempt from being a CSA according to the Department of Education. So that's why this scenario is a little bit more specific in that way. Some people are also asking if the professor isn't necessarily a responsible employee. That is accurate. So institutions, there's nothing in Title IX right now that says that all faculty are definitely responsible employees. What we would, challenge perhaps is if the Department of Education were to ask you why a faculty member is not designated as a responsible employee, there would need to be a response grounded in how they do not meet the definition as presented in that flow chart, which is possible. There are many institutions that do not consider their faculty to be responsible employees, but it is a slightly harder standard to meet than it is for considering faculty to not be CSAs. And then just want to reiterate this point as well. Campuses may very well decide to name their faculty as CSAs, even though they are not required to by the Clery Act. That is a campus decision that can be made and may often be made. Bridget and Maggie, would you actually want to reinforce anything around that responsible employee part right now?
Yeah, I would just highlight again one of the comments that I mentioned regarding confidential resources. A campus advocate doesn't necessarily automatically qualify as a responsible employee. It would depend on the designation the school has made as to whether or not they're a confidential resource. So I would just want to make sure that the professor also clearly understands who has been designated as confidential versus a responsible employee. And then Maggie wanted to highlight kind of the other ways that a faculty member may learn about information that needs to be reported to the Title IX coordinator or the designated person within the campus to be notified of a report.
So as we know, professors interact with students in a variety of ways, whether that's in office hours or actually in classroom discussions or writing assignments or presentations where students might affirmatively either personally disclose or disclose about other students around them. And there is, while it's not directly in the sub-regulatory guidance, there was a question and answer letter that went back and forth that discussed whether or not a disclosure during a writing assignment or classroom presentation would require, and there was the interpretation that it wouldn't. However, there are some institutions that have taken the approach that a disclosure in a writing assignment would be a disclosure, and those types of policies would really need to be reiterated to students, such as something like a syllabus notation. But as of now, it's not considered a way that you have to, but there are a number of institutions that have determined that would be a reportable disclosure.
Great. Thank you so much, Maggie and Bridget. We're going to go to the information shared reporting flowchart. This is a very miniature version of it right here, but if you go to the first flowchart that is shared in that PDF that was sent as an attachment or is available in the files pod, that is what we are talking about right now when we say the information shared reporting flowchart. It's that first one that I had described initially. It takes into account that you already know if you are a CSA and a responsible employee, and you're making a decision about what actions you should take based on the nature of the information that you are receiving. So again, if you're thinking really about the process that it would require to develop each of these types of flowcharts at your institution, it would really get everyone on the same page for understanding what the reporting responsibilities are of each individual and what the process is for when certain information comes through for each type of these roles, which would be really valuable to know on any campus. So looking through that flowchart that we've already gone through, we're going to tackle our next case study. And this one is just in honor of any Game of Thrones fans that are out there. One day at Westeros University, a responsible employee overhears information about a hate crime and reports this information to public safety. So one more time, I'll read that. One day at Westeros University, a responsible employee overhears information about a hate crime and reports this information to public safety. So use the information shared reporting flowchart to determine what information, if any, from the case study above needs to be reported based on this individual's role as a responsible employee. So I'll give you all a couple of moments to take into consideration that scenario and share your answers in the chat box with everyone. Okay, great. So some of the responses coming through are taking into account the various layers that are present in this case study. I should note too, I didn't want to set us up saying this, but these case studies are intentionally layered and slightly complicated. So all of you that are providing responses, though, are picking up on all of those pieces. So truly, job well done for all of you. It shows that you all definitely are in this work all the time. So a couple of different pieces that are being noted here. One is that the nature of the information does not seem to be directly tied to a responsible employee's reporting responsibilities, which are admittedly narrower than a CSA's. So if the individual that we are talking about is just a responsible employee, then they are not really required to report anything at all in this case because of the nature of the information, because they are just a responsible employee, and because this information is actually also overheard. It's not directly reported to them, although that distinction is really mostly applied to CSAs. That idea of things that are overheard need not be shared is really referencing guidance from the handbook, which is specific to Clery, but that is still helpful to note in this scenario. Another frame that individuals are taking is if this individual wants to share this information, it's not permitted that they don't share it. So they're not required to report, but it is okay if they want to. But it is trying to keep straight that responsible employees are really only required to report information on sex or gender-based discrimination or harassment. And a CSA would be most responsible to report hate crimes that are reported to them. So again, there is never just one clear answer. There are so many different contexts to take into consideration. So we presented this case study in this way to clarify some of the points that you all are drawing. So, recognizing whether or not this individual is just a responsible employee or just a CSA or both, and what that means in terms of their role, what the difference is between overhearing the information or not, and whether there's a difference between that nature of that information and what they're required to do with it. Again, want to reiterate, though, there's nothing in Clery that prohibits somebody who is not a CSA from reporting information. Clery is really just about dictating who is ultimately required to. So we're just moving into the next section here. Before we get into these considerations, it might be a helpful time to provide some small bits of information around I know we're coming to the end of our webinar, but maybe some small information as to what the announcement was from Ed. I don't know, Bridget, if you wanted to touch on that, just because I know you've been following it a little bit.
I have been following it a little bit and trying to keep up with some of the feeds that are coming out. It looks like there's going to be an open public comment period for the public to respond to the 2011 guidance, and during that time, the current status quo of what the guidance says will be in existence until there's a decision made at the end of that public comment period. So to the extent it would affect the obligations of those on the webinar today, and you have opinions about that, there is an opportunity to participate in the public comment period, and we hope that people, take advantage of that to the extent they're able to.
Awesome. What a helpful summary. Thank you so much, Bridget. Was there any sort of timeline given for that public comment period, or do we not know all of that just yet?
I haven't seen it. It's possible that it's come out, and I haven't seen it yet. But if I see something specific, I will make sure to jump in and let everyone know what I find out.
Great. Awesome. Thanks so much. I actually see that Abby just included in the chat box a link to an article about the announcement. So that is directly available to all of you. But thanks so much. I just wanted to make sure we didn't completely give you a chance to talk through that, because I know you've been listening and Abby's been listening so intently. So thank you all so much. So basically, in talking through the development of these reporting systems, some structural considerations to take into account when you are developing these things are listed here on this slide. And some of these things might be more obvious than others, but they're still helpful to note, particularly if you're thinking that developing such a flowchart for your campus would be beneficial. One of those things is definitely the size of your institution. There are certainly varied amounts of resources dedicated to compliant reporting procedures depending on the amount of individuals that are attached to your institution. So knowing that, it might be more or less helpful to have such flowcharts if things are more or less obvious already on your campus. Knowing, too, that depending on the size of your institution, a one-page flowchart might be not even possible because there are so many other layers to take into account. So we do note that as well. A public safety department versus a police department certainly does get involved in terms of whether or not you are going to be reporting a certain way or not. Additionally, the presence of a Clery coordinator versus your public safety department or police department as your receptacle of all of that crime information, in addition to a Title IX coordinator, makes all of those things taken into account, makes those flowcharts perhaps a little bit more heady to think through, but would make a difference as to where you would ultimately report that information. Keeping in mind, too, that the use of resources such as reporting forms and reporting forms guidelines help to standardize that information that's collected. So the more you implement tools that standardize the information gathering, the more it makes sense to have a tool that standardizes the way you then report that information. So having a reporting flowchart, if there is no other formalized system for reporting, is less than helpful. I think it's most helpful to have any sort of consistency in terms of streamlining be present. So having a reporting structure and process as well as having a consistent way to then actually document and share that information through the use of a form, et cetera. And then lastly, just something to take into account is any sort of awareness campaigns that can exist to help students and employees understand the reporting obligations of different members of campus, and then what that means, where their report goes after that report has been made, are all really helpful things to think about when you are developing a document or a tool like this. Bridget and Maggie, would you add anything in here under reporting structure?
I don't think we'll add, maybe on the next slide under the continued considerations.
Sure, yep, absolutely. And you can, if you actually wanted to start with that, because I know it does talk through confidential and privileged pieces, we can definitely take it off of you.
Yeah, we use the terms confidentiality, privacy, privilege a lot in contexts that sort of confuse the real differences that exist between the words. Confidentiality is this expectation that we're going to share information. Usually it's shared with specific professionals, and it will not be reshared without our permission. It's a concept that is really founded in ethical practices that apply to these various professional, professional licensure positions like doctors, attorneys, counselors, social workers. Many organizations also will just take a specific step to say they're going to have a confidentiality practice or policy, even if they're not legally required to do so. Privacy, on the other hand, is really an expectation that we have a right to choose what information we want to share and to whom we want to share it. And this expectation of confidentiality that is, we get to choose who we share our private information with, is really about expecting someone to not reshare that information. And that's where the confidentiality expectation comes into play. However, there are a lot of jurisdictions who have passed laws requiring confidentiality through what is called a legal privilege. And this concept means that the private information that has been shared with a professional, again, a counselor or attorney, under the guise of confidentiality is not allowed to be reshared by that professional. And I have this sort of in asterisks in my mind, unless it's ordered by a court or, of course, if you have consent by the person who shared the information to redisclose. And I think what's important as we think about CSAs and responsible employees and their obligations is, again, that consideration of the intersection with those obligations and local privilege laws. And I already talked briefly about the consideration of if a local privilege law requires consent to redisclose is given in writing, but maybe the school's policy does not, you need to make sure you're meeting the local law. I also think one example to think about in regards to the intersection with local state laws around privilege is that a school may actually designate a particular role as a responsible employee, but they may also qualify as someone who has a local privilege law, maybe as a rape crisis counselor, and one of the roles that they play And so they may not be able to redisclose specifically without consent, and there may actually be a conflict with what the school has said is someone's obligation to redisclose information as a responsible employee and what the local privilege or licensure obligations are of that person's professional ethical obligations. And if that's the case, we don't have any good guidance other than seek out your legal guidance from your in-house counsel or out-house counsel and get really clear guidance on how a school should be giving directives to responsible employees who do have a conflict with a local privilege law.
Bridget, this is Laura. For that last example that you're sharing, do you mean if that's somebody that's named as a responsible employee on a campus and the role that they're functioning in on a campus is like a rape crisis counselor and then they're a rape crisis counselor in the community? Or you mean they could be a variety of roles on campus, and then in the community they are a counselor that has local privilege? You're saying that there's no clear guidance on whether or not that local privilege, even if that's not their role on the campus, is impacting their ability to be a responsible employee on the campus?
Yeah, exactly. So I think from a professional's perspective, sometimes, when a local privilege has designated them as a sexual assault crisis counselor, and the redisclosure of that in some local jurisdictions like ours may attach to it criminal liabilities for redisclosure, even if their school policy is that they should be sharing information with the Title IX coordinator or a designated employee, but they happen, let's say in the second example, they happen to be a rape crisis counselor as a volunteer in the community off time, they may need to just get guidance on how it would impact their professional obligations in order to meet their obligations as a responsible employee in their role at the campus.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So one other chat box question as we are coming to the end of our time together, and before we open it up for you all to ask some other questions, would be what other challenges arise when establishing reporting systems or structures at your institution? What other factors do you all take into consideration? So that is opening it up to all of you attendees to answer. What challenges arise when establishing reporting systems, and what other factors do you take into consideration when establishing reporting systems? And again, just giving folks some time to respond. I know we've been asking a lot of you attendees, we've been asking you to answer a lot of questions, so we put you through your paces this hour and a half. I do see some responses are beginning to come in. So I see that folks are saying that they just are, always concerned about making sure that double counting is not happening or that duplicate reporting is not happening, and that sometimes that tends to be the most challenging when trying to honor the source of the information if it's coming from a confidential source who really is just giving the limited non-identifiable information. Absolutely. Trying to get a consistent reporting system to gather that crime data for off-campus trips is proving to be a little bit more challenging than just taking care of core campus. Totally can understand that as well, especially as there was possibly an increase in the number of locations that your institution is now considering an off-campus trip based on the renewed guidance. Yep. Any additional concerns or struggles that people have? I'm going to read this one aloud because I think it applies to many folks. It says, student life gets complicated and sometimes issues are mislabeled as to what the incident or the issue is truly about. Sometimes I get issues that are truly academic, and other times what seems as academic is more in the realm of harassment. So that really speaks to so much, and thank you for sharing that point. I know you all can read these too, but sometimes I think it's just helpful to highlight the ones that come through. That point really gets to the heart of the importance of training all of the individuals that are reporting authorities so that they are really clear on what nature of an incident means and why that's important information in gathering at that initial intake. I know this is a fine line because we say the CSAs aren't supposed to be investigating, but you also want a full amount of information when you report that information so that the people that assess whether or not this is sex discrimination or a Clery crime or a Title IX violation, et cetera, have all the information they have to do that. And so it really is making sure that the folks that are your reporting authorities are empowered to, in a compassionate way, ask questions of an individual if they are permitted to do so. So if they are a CSA, if they are a responsible employee, that helps give them a greater understanding of the nature of the incident that's being shared with them so that they then know the best next steps to take. And that is a tall order. I totally understand that, particularly when you might get 10 to 15 minutes of in-person time, if at all, with the individuals that you're expected to train as a reporting authority. So totally understand where you're coming from here. I know that many people are saying you'd much rather have something reported and then have other folks handle the additional follow-up and investigation rather than nothing for fear of it not meeting. So totally get that as well. Okay, great. So I mean, with the last 3 minutes here, we do want to make sure that we are giving folks the opportunity to ask us any additional questions that they might have. Bridget and Maggie, and I know Abby hasn't spoken today just as much because she is handling so many of the questions, but if any of the three of you have seen any questions come through that you think it would be helpful to highlight before we end our webinar today, please feel free to do so. I know one of the questions that was asked earlier was from a resident. I think it was a question asking if resident assistants are permitted to ask additional questions when information is initially shared with them if they don't feel like they have enough information to qualify, for a Clery report or not. And so what I will say is there is nothing in Clery that speaks to anything more than saying that you are not required to investigate. So yeah, you are not expected to investigate whether or not the incident that is reported is actually a violation or is actually that crime. There is nothing that prohibits somebody from asking clarifying questions if they are confused about the nature of the information that is shared with them. But again, I think that's a really great point to bring up in training, like the fine line between clarifying what's being shared and not coming across as interrogating or investigating, particularly if you are a CSA or a responsible employee. But a really good, helpful thing to note there. So really great question there. Bridget and Maggie, I really want to make sure I'm giving you all some time. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no problem. This is Abby. I know that I've been playing the behind-the-scenes role, but I also just wanted to chime in. One, it was really fantastic to see all the dialogue and the back and forth that was happening in the chat. And I think one thing that always comes out of this conversation, and just something I want to reinforce, something that was really eloquently described earlier in the webinar, is the purpose of sharing information through Clery, because a lot of times when we're talking about reporting and there are questions around investigation, we forget that when we're thinking about just the statistics specifically, they're meant to reflect incidents that are reported within the community, not necessarily the result of a disciplinary process or the criminal justice process or any other steps. So Clery does provide that flexibility that the individual reporting can still make decisions as to what process and what options are best for them, while at the same time creating spaces where these trusted members of our community, our campus security authorities, and certainly responsible employees are as well, are able to share the information that they know, because they are the ones that are more likely to receive these types of reports, because people may feel more comfortable going to them. So it may take some reframing with your campus community to help explain that distinction to them, that when you are sharing statistics, when you're sharing information about this report, non-identifiable information, of course, that it really is intended to help the community understand what incidents are being reported, not necessarily the outcome of those specific processes. So thank you for saying that so well earlier, and I just wanted to reinforce that.
Great, thank you so much, Abby. There is one question that I think would be a helpful one to address to the group before we end the webinar. And this question is, if a student discloses dating violence to the Title IX coordinator but does not want the police notified, does that crime need to go on the crime log? So I think a couple of different things need to be taken into account here. The guidance from, and Abby, please feel free to jump in if you would like to add anything to this. But if, as the Department of Education has reiterated, Crimes that should be added to the daily crime log are those that are reported to the campus security or police department directly that are taking place within the jurisdiction of the campus's patrol jurisdiction. So what would matter here is as to whether or not it goes on the crime log would really be about the location of where that dating violence took place. And then the Title IX coordinator could very well be sharing that information, but they would also have to take into consideration if that student is asking for confidentiality and would weigh that request versus whether or not they just don't want the police notified, and maybe also reframing for that student that informing the police does not automatically start an investigation per se if they want to make a voluntary confidential report to the police, if that's an option. And again, when you say police, I'm not sure if you mean campus police here or local law enforcement. So there are those considerations to take into account as well. Basically, the answer is, and I know that this is frustrating sometimes, but it would depend on a lot of different factors. So it's not such a simple, quick answer. Abby, would you add anything to that? And if not, I would just want to make sure that Bridget and Maggie have the opportunity to say something before we end, because I know we are already after. Thank you for participating and being a part of today, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.